Well, thank you, Paul, for the wonderful introduction, and I'm greatly honored to stand here together with Manuel and Adam to talk about innovation policy, and for that, even global innovation policy. I'll try to convince you that that is a thing that certainly does not exist yet. I'm not even sure that international innovation policy exists, because my perception is that these policies are heavily national and that we're limping behind other policy areas in terms of international coordination to a large degree. I also have to confess that initially I did not quite know what the antipodes were. I have been illuminated ever since. It didn't help that on the website there's another title that talks about the edge of the world, and you will have to say something about that. I did not invent that. Here's my little agenda. I'll introduce this by talking a little bit about differences and similarities, and in doing that I'm retracing a little bit of my educational process, because when I stepped into the first science policy class, which was held by Harvey Brooks and Lou Branscombe at the Kennedy School of Government, I was struck by some of the differences in how this particular policy field is set up in different nations. And again, much more so than in other policy fields. There may be good reasons for that. I'll try to give you a brief history of innovation policies starting somewhere in the 19th century, emphasis on brief, because I think that there have been some very interesting developments that tell us a little bit about why these systems are so different. Essentially, there's a path dependence here, which has been brought out in, for example, in paradigms like national systems of innovation and so forth, and I want to talk about that. I'll give you some impressions. How does public policy work? There is a verb missing here, sorry for that. And that's a slightly satirical view of what the process is like. And in doing that, I'm drawing very much on 10 years of experience now in an advisory body of the German government called the Commission of Experts for Research and Innovation, which is an independent body. So we can pick our own questions, our own answers even. We have some money to commission studies. We have sort of a ticket to annoy, or to enlighten, or to bring enjoyment to policymakers, and we do all of that. And in that process, some of these impressions have come to the fore. And the last point is essentially things to come. That's my prediction of topics that I think will have some importance in the coming years when we're talking about innovation research and innovation policy. If you look at this, you'll find very, very different organizational setups. Take the, for example, the US versus Germany versus Israel and so forth. Just to give you an example, the United States does not have any research or innovation ministry. It's a rather fragmented policy that is made by the various departments or ministries. In many of the other countries, Germany is an example, France is an example, you have something like one agency that takes care of that. So the whole set of coordination issues is very, very different. And there might be a number of hypotheses that, or explanations for that, whether it's a small or a large country, whether you are centralized or decentralized. And an interesting question there is also how aligned the whole thing is with the self-governance of science. So lately I've become very interested in the organization of academies of science, which again differs considerably, with tremendous differences in, for example, the influence that industry has in these academies. What are the dominant tools of the trade? Again, some differences between countries, but much more convergence here, okay? So typically, we rely in this policy field on the supply side, on the production side. So the basic philosophy is we do not have enough approaches for solving the problems at hand. So we subsidize or we incentivize the supply side, the R&D side, in corporations, on the scientific side, and so forth. Now, there are arguments to be made in favor of more diffusion-oriented policies or demand-side policies. And by the way, some countries do that. Scandinavian countries, Austria, and so forth have developed policies in this field. So, but for now, the supply side dominates strongly. Now, even then, you can choose between different modes how you want to do that. Some countries rely heavily on tax instruments, which I would also call non-directional instruments, because they just rely on some definition of R&D. And if you do a certain amount of R&D, something that is proportional to that amount can be deducted from the tax debt, or you do some expensing in excess of 100% of the R&D expenditures and so forth. So that's non-directional. Most countries do rely on subsidies. And policymakers have some preference for bringing their preferences as to what technical change they would like to have into the game. I remember one very interesting discussion with members of the German parliament where this commission that I'm part of professed a certain preference for text-based systems, and one member of parliament, a very smart lady from the more left-wing party, said, well, why should I want to do that? I can't control and I can't steer with that. By the way, the German word for text is Steuer, and that comes from steering. So there's a slight misnomer in there. So directional versus non-directional is important and assumes new importance right now, and I'll come back to that. So here's my brief history. All of the elements that we're talking about have been there. They have been there before the 19th century. And if you read the first chapter of Susan Skotchemer's book, you'll find them. She lists them very nicely. They have been there, but not used systematically. That only starts really with the emergence of industrial R&D in the late 19th century, so around 1870, 1875. We have the railway R&D labs in the United States. The chemical industry develops its labs. So starting there, we have sort of a formalization, a systematic process. And at the same time, roughly about the same time, there's stuff like land-grant universities in the United States, which I would call a enabling of a bottom-up approach. You throw the asset at the decision makers, you let them do it. Whereas in Germany, we have some top-down policies called Kulturpolitik, a guy by the name of Harhoff, who fought to bring Einstein, Max Planck, and many others into seminal positions in science. And he was sort of the orchestrator in the back. We also have in various countries, and I'm talking here about Germany, but you can make the same point about other countries as well, federal competition. If you look at the evolution of the chemical industry, okay, there's the Prussian government gets von Hofmann, who has been teaching in the UK, in the United Kingdom, back to Germany. And the Bavarian government immediately gives an institute of the same size to a guy by the name of Bayer, and both produce 400 PhDs. We become sort of the ferment of the new chemical industry. So all of these elements that we observe today have been there, and they have evolved from there. In the early 20th century, we essentially refine in industry the R&D model, where R&D is performed at the headquarters of the corporation. That is about to change in the 1960s. And after post-World War II, after quite a bit of investment has gone into the military component of R&D, weapons development, radar, and so forth, we have a seminal book by Vannevar Bush that popped up in Ben Jones' presentation already, where he talks about science as the endless frontier and outlines a system, including the National Science Foundation, how this can be financed to the benefit of the population at large. Now, it's not just the benefit of the population at large. Mind you, science is a player here, is a stakeholder, and we are asking for more money. We should be aware of the fact that we are asking for more professorships, higher salaries, or whatsoever that benefits us. In the 1950s to 1980s, we see sort of technology policy coming up, and it comes out of space technology, it comes out of nuclear technology. If you look at Germany, we had a ministry in the 50s for nuclear technology, which then became the technology ministry, which then became the research ministry. Many countries have had similar paths of evolution from large-scale technology, mostly nuclear, to R&D in general. And we also see that there is then an evolution of subsidies for large-scale projects in industry. So government finances industry activities, which is something that is new to a certain degree. We see measurement devices coming up, the Frascati manual, the definition of research and development, which is very, very important in many ways, not just for the tax credits, but also for measurement, comparison, rankings, and so forth. And we also see, starting in the 1960s, of course, I'll take the seminal work by Arrow and by others, the contribution of economics, or the first big contribution of economics, namely to identify market failures and then to develop tools that help to alleviate those market failures. Now, at that point, let me tell you already, the famous NBR volume, 1963, has the title, The Rate and Direction of Technical Change. In the coming 20 years, we forget about direction, we only do rate. 1980s sees the evolution of tax instruments, mostly in the United States, but also in Australia and Canada. There's an expansion of terminology, so we see the OECD for the first time worry about R&D being too narrow, and they define a terminology for innovation in the Oslo Manual, which becomes the basis for the community innovation surveys, mostly undertaken first in Europe. There's an attempt in the mid-90s to bring that to the United States, but that is not successful, and there's a full story behind that, but I will not tell that here. 90s also see the evolution of cluster policies. And by the way, not all of these terms or policies and so forth are coming out of economics. Some come out of sociology, some come out of from legal folks, some come out from regional economics as cluster policies, for example. That is interesting in its own right, but I can't give that justice here. One that is very important and that I have criticized in other presentations of this type is national systems of innovation, because in my perception that was a concept that was so eagerly taken up by the policymakers before academics were ever able to develop it thoroughly. And the reason why national systems of innovation was taken up so eagerly was that it gave great freedom to the policymakers to choose particular instruments and somehow justify them within this particular concept. The concept has a very, very original and a very good core, which is complementarities between, say, the labor market, financing means, and so forth within a nation. And these complementarities are very important. They pop up later in an AR article by Milgram and Roberts. But these people got there first. One has to give them credit for that. But it also creates a lot of leeway for a lot of very different, very heterogeneous policies, which were not always, I think, to the target. 2000 grand challenges, completely new term, mostly in the United States and Canada, which essentially says, look, there are big problems out there, science should solve them. So here comes the directional approach back into the picture. It's no longer we do R&D and that's good, or we do science and it's good. No, we ought to do the science in this particular direction. And by the way, there's a strong tendency to bring this back right now. Curiosity-driven science per se is currently under attack in many countries, as far as I can tell. At some point, you of course have to ask, well, is there international collaboration, at least on those problems that create huge positive externalities that are of the fundamental R&D type? Because we wouldn't necessarily want to have duplication in these, or at least we should talk. And this is, of course, one of the motivation of European programs. At the same time, leaving aside collaboration, we have a lot of competition and beggar thy neighbor effects using R&D subsidies, tax arrangements, and most lately patent boxes. An invention, this country has a patent box, and I would like to say that a patent box is nothing else but a beggar thy neighbor policy, where you try with shifting patents to a country where you only pay 10% of income on the licensing revenues, try to do something there. And by the way, the OECD has responded to that within its base erosion and profit shifting program, maybe a little bit more. There's a lot coming up in recent years. Participatory frameworks, citizen involvement, social innovation, innovation labs, maker spaces. Just to give you a very concrete impression of what that means, it means that the government gives a large hospital in Stockholm, for example, the financial means to put a maker space, machinery and so forth, within the hospital, so that the doctors can experiment with new medical devices, that even the patients may experiment with exactly that. And the interesting question is, What does it do? And the impact assessments are on their way. By the way, this is stuff that is slightly outside of the focus of our mainstream conferences. If I think of NBR Summer Institute and so forth, this is not yet on the radar. So, individuals matter. So do their incentives. Imagine the following. Young person in the Federal Ministry of Research in Germany meets the minister in the elevator. Minister asks, how are you doing? Oh, everything's fine. We corrected the externalities, the incentives are fine, all complementarities are in place. It's very likely that the minister will ask, what I'm paying you for? Okay? So, no wonder the dream of a young employee in this ministry is to at one point in time run their own subsidy program or their own instrument to come up in a brilliant manner with something that is completely new. And that gives rise to this, a fashion every 3 or 4 years. Okay, I'm describing a possibility. Everything is, of course, fine. None of that is happening, really. But, you know, okay. Second insight. This is a contested space. Lobbyists will defend their turf with almost any means available. We're talking a lot of money for various industries. It's highly heterogeneous, but believe me, they will and they go after you or anybody who opens their mouth in this case. And it can be from your best friends on the green side, the ecological side, when you dare to say, well, we are subsidizing solar with 23 billion a year. Is that really meaningful? Should we do that? Okay? So even pro-environmental and so forth quickly form lobbies that protect the lobby. That's, I think, political economy of the finest that we have seen. In that, public policy institutions evolve that are highly complex, and some commission studies to understand themselves. I will not say which one that is, but I think that that is really bizarre. That's the top of it. Last but not least, timing matters. So if you have a brilliant idea, and you say, you talk about that idea 2 years after the general election, and 3 years prior to the next general election, this will fall flat. There are good points in time when you can do this, okay? And there are not so good points in time. Note by now, the policy advisor has become part of the game and tries to sort of transport what he's saying with great efficacy. Let me conclude. Things to come. Anything digital and business model innovation. I think we'll see much more discussion in the next 5 to 8, 10 years about how quickly countries can adapt to this change via implementing business models rather than new technology. Point 2, some of these areas will be much more dependent on standardization than we have seen in the mobile phone industry so far. That means that Internet of Things runs the danger of running into the same patent wars, the same, I would call it ineffective controversies between stakeholders in that industry that we have seen in the past. And there's a battle right now going on whether some of that should be remedied either in the SSOs at the start of that pipeline or in the courts. BEPS and tax policies, I talked about that already. The OECD has made, I think, a good move to sort of minimize or reduce the extent of dysfunctional competition in this space. So they have come with a new principle called the Nexus Principle to delimit the effect of patent boxes, and I think that's a positive step. We see a return of industrial policies in some countries. Okay, industrial policy was off the political map. It was a bad word. It wasn't used very much. It's coming back. And it's typically oriented towards achieving some kind of national advantage with the tool of R&D policies. And some of these things, I think, can be highly dysfunctional, and they counteract any form of international coordination that we may want to have here. Last but not least, the direction of change is back. And I think there is a very appropriate discussion on that, and there is a battle going on to direct even fundamental R&D, fundamental science in particular directions. And I think we, as a community that is interested in innovation and, of course, intellectual property as well, should develop answers that tell us, why is curiosity-driven science a good thing, right? Under which circumstances would we want to see policymakers get involved in directing research in a particular direction? There's a good argument for that as well. But I don't think that we have really good answers at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was enjoying myself in the siesta listening to you. Now I have to interrupt the siesta to speak myself. You know, it's not good. So what I intend to do, how much time I have? 10, 20 minutes? Oof. I will have to invent some. Too much. The siesta, right. Sit and relax. What I intend to do is to start with the innovation policy in Israel and then go on to discuss much more general issues. Now, as you probably know, Israel is an incredibly success story in terms of innovation. It's been called the startup nation, and indeed, you know, all indicators point to that incredible success. You know, just to mention a few, Israel has the second highest R&D to GDP ratio. We used to have the highest, and South Korea overtook us. We have one of the highest patents per capita. You know, the number of startups, etc. Venture capital, the second highest after the US. The number of IPOs in NASDAQ is the second highest, again, after the US. And the remarkable figure is that the absolute number is almost like the total number from the Europe, the total number of IPOs in NASDAQ. So regardless how you look at it, it's really an amazing success story. Now, innovation policy was very explicit since the early 70s. And indeed, in that history that Dietmar presented, Israel was really a newcomer in the 70s, but a pioneer in setting up patterns of policies that were later adopted by many other countries. So we may be tempted to conclude, here you have, you know, very smart policy, great success. Well, I would like to qualify that. And I will want to qualify it in two ways. The extent to which policy played a role and the extent to which this is a success. Let me start with policy. So yes, Israel put in place a system of support of commercial R&D, very innovative in itself, and you know, it really played an important role. But let me say that some of the features of the Israeli environment that was conducive and critical for success was not due to policy. And let me point out two. One is actually a policy omission. It turns out that in Israel, out of neglect, not of being smart, okay, the government never tried to be greedy about getting intellectual property rights or any economic return out of research done in institutions supported by the state, including universities, including hospitals, including the army. So a lot of research with commercial applications was done in these institutions, and the government never attempted to take a cut at that. And that was very favorable to research because the young people doing research in any of these institutions could pursue starting up startups and so forth and profit from it without having to report to the government and having the government take a cut and therefore diminish the incentives. At universities in Israel, universities had TTOs, technology transfer offices, much before this was a concept anywhere in the world since the 1950s, which is really extraordinary. But the government, these are institutions that are funded by the government. The government, to this day, doesn't take anything out of it. So it's really, these mechanisms were there, and there was a policy omission or neglect, if you wish, that was very favorable to the development of innovation. The second one is, I mentioned universities. Israel has a very good university system. And again, this university, the best three institutions, the Hebrew University, the Technion, and the Weizmann Institute, which are well renowned all over the world, they were established before the creation of the state. And in fact, that very fact that they were created before, and therefore they had a great deal of autonomy, and that autonomy was preserved. That's one of the main features of being such great institutions. In that sense, it's similar to the US. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, where, Yale, I'm not sure, but Princeton for sure and Harvard were created, much before the creation of the US of America. And so, they have a history of autonomy and excellence, which does not depend upon the state for it. So that's, again, not policy, but luck, if you wish. And the third one, which I'm going to elaborate in a moment, is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is very different from R&D. We tend to confuse the two. In my appreciation, it's the critical factor, and that's something that definitely the government has little control, certainly with the traditional innovation policies. And indeed, we have plenty of entrepreneurship in Israel, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So that's the first point. Now, in order to do justice to policy, there are two features of innovation policy in Israel which are good. And one is neutrality, what you call Dietmar non-directional. So the system of support does not pick winners, but essentially responds to whatever the market brings to the forefront. And that has proven to be a very effective policy. So avoiding the pitfalls of industrial policies. And the second, which tend to overlook, which typically we tend to overlook, is the fact that these policies, by design, have been, for the most part, very dynamic. And in particular, there is one particular policy that I want to remark, and I want to remember. And there was a policy initiative, a government initiative, to set up a venture capital industry. And at the beginning, it was funded by the government. But it had a self-termination clause, self-destruct clause. So after 3 years, when the policy proved to be successful, that agency or that initiative disappeared, was terminated. And I bring that as an example because the very subject matter of innovation policy, by definition, is changing all the time. It's dynamic, So what was true and necessary and fine 30 years ago cannot be fine today. But bureaucracies tend to there is a lot of inertia, tend to reproduce themselves, So in terms of innovation policy, you need to put in place a mechanism to change the very policies and the very leitmotifs of these policies, So these two features, neutrality and dynamism, are critical. Now, in terms of benefits, I say that I'm not so sure that the story of innovation in Israel is that successful. What do I mean by that? I say all the indications are that these are great successes. Yes, but the question is who benefits? And the fact is that the tremendous success of innovation in Israel has not brought generalized prosperity to the Israeli population, but in fact has created a dual economy. Those that associated with what we call the high-tech sector, the dynamic, startups and all that, which account for between 10 and 13% of the workforce. They benefit enormously, And you see that all over the place. And there is a service sector associated with it as well. But the majority of the population in Israel has not benefited from it. Inequality has grown a lot. In part, I'm not saying that that's the main reason, but in part as a consequence of this dichotomy. And there are good reasons, quote unquote, for this having happened in terms of what's the nature of these innovations, what they are aimed at, and so forth and so on. So that's kind of the mixed kind of assessment of both the reach of policy and the success, what we consider success. And that brings me to the more general issues. So, linking to what Dietmar was describing, by the way, Dietmar, I think I differ with you in one thing. When you say that innovation policy goes back to the 19th century, you were talking about science policy. And that's essentially, and that's quite different from what we call now innovation policy in the sense of commercial, R&D, and so forth. So the majority of that all policies were aimed at increasing science or encouraging science, and not so much what we call now innovation. But that's a semantic thing. So essentially, from my point of view, the current innovation policy we know, as Dietmar pointed out, I mean, in economics, it started with Kenneth Arrow, and essentially, it's very simple to state. What you say is the following: what we are after is economic growth of GDP. We prove solo that the main factor in growth is technical progress. We know that what drives technical progress is innovation, and we know that there is an appropriability problem because, if you cannot appropriate all the benefits of your innovations, then you're going to do less innovation that is socially optimal. And therefore, our role is twofold: to increase appropriability via IP and so forth, strengthen IP. And second, even that is not enough, okay? And therefore, we have to subsidize R&D. Okay, that's it. I mean, that's what innovation policy, as we know, is all about, okay? Not enough because of inherent features of the system, okay? And in order to sort of maximize GDP growth, you have to subsidize R&D and increase the strength of IP. Well, I want to question all that, okay? First of all, the fact is that a lot of what we consider innovation justly so doesn't show up in GDP as measured, okay? In particular, that's true in health. Longevity and the quality of life and so forth, that doesn't show up in the way we measure GDP. So a lot of innovation doesn't leave a trace in what we are supposed to be maximizing. And the policies, and Dietmar referred to that, politicians, and now I know it from too close for comfort, I mean, politicians are very keen in the figures that can make a headline, okay? And if, the rate of growth in the economy goes up and down, that has political implications. And so if you can increase the visible statistics, you will do it, okay? So this is not just for telling economic history of what happened. This has real consequences. And so a lot of what really we care for, and is an integral part of our well-being, is not being reflected in the thing we are trying to maximize, okay? So that's a big thing, particularly in innovation. This is true in general. But it's particularly so in innovation because a lot of our present technologies, the digitation and so forth, are of a nature that don't show up in measured statistics, GDP, etc. And so we are kind of off between the technology, okay, what the technology is doing for us and where we are trying to pursue in terms of economic policies. And that's really very, very dangerous. The other thing, I mentioned inequality in Israel. Well, inequality, as you know well, is a huge issue all over the world, certainly in Europe, certainly in the US, okay? And there has been a dramatic increase in inequality, particularly in the share of the 1 over 1,000th of the, how do you call it, the 1 yeah, 1/10 of what percent, whatever, that, that appropriates an increasing fraction of GDP, certainly of GDP growth in the past 15 to 20 years. And again, you say, well, wait a moment. I mean, we are kind of pursuing policies that will increase something that we shouldn't, we are not measuring correctly, but nevertheless, we're increasing the pie, okay? And most of that increase goes to a very small fraction of the population. Then what are we doing here? And so, in my view, we should think differently also of innovation policy vis-a-vis that issue. And the point that I want to make is that what we should be pursuing is essentially what we call inclusive growth, and inclusive growth not necessarily of GDP, but of something like the Human Development Index or things of that nature. So both the inclusiveness is what we should be after, and the much wider definition of what is it that we want to increase for the benefit, for the well-being of people, okay? And that may lead you to very different places than just to subsidize R&D or to increase the strength of patents as we know them. And let me give you a couple of examples of that, okay? Walmart, who is the biggest employer in the world outside China, Walmart introduced a vast array of innovations, there is no question about it, that brought about the, that I have to be careful with my words, but that for the million or so employees of Walmart, it didn't bring much good, but the contrary. And essentially because the type of innovations that were adopted were such that were really turning the employee into an unthinking robot, okay, that had to be controlled. Is that the only way that innovation can go? No. There is a different approach to innovation, which is what I tend to call human-enhancing innovations, which are innovations that do exactly the opposite, that enhance, strengthen, empower human beings to be able to do their jobs in a more intelligent, in a way that requires kind of more skills, not less skills, and so forth. Is that applicable to all jobs? Not necessarily, but there is nothing that is a law of nature that innovation has to go the Walmart direction vis-a-vis other directions. That's one example of what I'm talking about. A second, it's not an example of innovation, but you will see why I mention it, is what do you do in the service sector, which is really the largest employer by far, and it's, when you look at the figures in the US, it's remarkable. Essentially, in the next 10 years, the projections of the BLS are that virtually all the increase in occupations in terms of the labor force in the US will be in the service sectors, and in particular in personal care and education. Now, in those occupations, you need to upgrade the skills needed, and you can do that. You need to do a professionalization of those services. And if you do that, then the type of innovations that you will be requiring for education, for health, for personal care, and so forth, will be of a human-enhancing nature and not the contrary. So it is a matter of policy, of what you choose to do in terms of what to support, what to encourage, what direction to go, in order to have, in the end, a innovation that will be more widely distributed, more inclusive, and that will affect other aspects of our lives and not just, increasing our GDP. So I see that as the main kind of challenge for us, and we have to, in my view, we have to take on that challenge in all avenues of research, including, of course, IP. Thank you very much.
There it is. Well, I'm feeling rather sheepish. Both of my predecessors did a great job of getting a very high-level keynote, end-of-conference sort of big think talk. And relative to that, I'm reminded of a exchange between Robert Solow and John Kenneth Galbraith in the late 60s, where Solow commented that the reason most economists didn't like John Kenneth Galbraith was because he worried about really big questions. And economists like to focus on small questions. So I guess they're the Galbraith-style economist, and I'll be the small-minded. I do think what I'm going to talk about is important, but it's a much narrower issue. I've been working, I started actually on this in the US quite a few years ago and have pursued it in New Zealand, thinking about how do we evaluate government Dietmar mentioned this briefly. We have these various programs that are supposed to do various things, whether it's encouraging science or encouraging innovation. We don't very often try to figure out how well they actually work. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And the background of this is this wider phenomenon. It's quite a big deal here in the UK and also in New Zealand, of so-called evidence-based policy, that we should be thinking about evidence when we devise policy. Many of us, and I think Manuel would probably agree with this from his policy experience, instead what we often get is policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. So we have some program and we hire an economist to demonstrate that it works well, which of course is not actually evidence-based policy. So we sort of have a particular view that we want to find evidence for. And what I'd like to advocate is that in the area of science and innovation policy, we should be serious about evidence-based policy. Now, this raises a number of analytical issues. I'm going to go through these quickly, and then in the end, I'm only going to talk about two of them. If we're going to talk about the effect of a policy, we need to be able to think about, if we can see what happened in the world, how does that differ from what would have happened if we didn't have the policy? What is the but-for world that we're comparing the actual world to? Frequently, we do that by comparing the performance of the entities that we support with the policy to the performance of entities that were not supported. And that is one strategy. I'm going to show you two examples of that, but it raises a tricky statistical conceptual issue about the selection bias in the program. The program is presumably choosing to support particular entities, so you have to deal with that when you try to do that. A second big issue is, what are we trying to do? And I'm going to connect this a little bit to what Manuel was talking about. If we take the viewpoint that we don't just want to maximize GDP, we have many different objectives. How do we measure those objectives? And we have to do that if we're going to talk about whether our programs are successful. I'll just briefly mention there are some other problems that I'm not going to say anything more about then. So these are the two I'm going to talk about. There are other problems. The lags are long. That makes it hard to measure these things. You have to figure out, are we trying to get the incremental impact of this program or the average impact? Are we trying to do this in some general equilibrium sense or just a partial equilibrium sense for a particular program? Those are also issues that I'm not going to say anything more about today. So I'm going to focus on the first two. There should be another circle. I don't know what happened to my PowerPoint around outputs and outcomes that are hard to measure. Those are going to be the things. Maybe the second circle is just in the wrong place. Okay, so what I'm going to do briefly in my few remaining minutes is I'm going to talk about three things that I've been working on in New Zealand to sort of illustrate these issues. I'm not going to present them as research results, although there are papers behind all of them if you're more interested. I'm going to try to talk about them more to illustrate the issues. One is an evaluation of a basic science, curiosity-driven science program. One is an evaluation of a firm R&D project subsidy program. And the last is about trying to quantify the objectives of mission-oriented research from a mission-led government agency. So the first one, talking about what's called the Marsden Fund in New Zealand, which is the basic science fund in New Zealand. It's named after Sir Ernest Marsden, whose main claim to fame is that he was a friend of Sir Ernest Rutherford, who's the only New Zealander who's ever won a Nobel Prize. So that's his claim to fame. So you can think of this as being somewhat like the National Science Foundation or the science competition in Europe. I'm not going to go into the details of the program, but scientists write proposals, they're evaluated by referees, and then the highest ranked proposals are funded. What's very exciting about, I think, the research we were able to do is we have several years of data on both the funded and the unfunded proposals, and we know what are the scores that all of these proposals got when they were evaluated at the time of submission, which gives us a very clean way of dealing with this selection bias problem. So what we do is, in this case, we're going to look at bibliometric measures of performance, because this is a basic science program, and we're going to look for what we call the treatment effect. Did the proposals that got money from this program do better, in some sense, than the proposals that didn't get money? In doing that, we're going to control for the selection bias. The ones that got the money were the ones that the panels thought were the best proposals. We're going to control for that statistically using the evaluation that they had at the time when the money was awarded. And then some details, I won't go into this more about exactly how we do this. We can talk about that more later. So we look at two things. We look at both the publications and the citations to those publications. I'm going to talk just about two aspects of the results. The row labeled funded, that's just a dummy variable for did that proposal get money? And the answer is the proposals that got money published more papers, and the papers that they published are more highly cited than the proposals that didn't get money. So that's good. The Marsden Fund people like that result. The other thing I find, again, the arrows don't come out in the right place. So the variable I actually want you to look at is this one. I think that gets rescaled somehow on a different computer. The variable I want you to look at is this one. That's essentially a measure of how good the panel thought this proposal was. And if you're thinking the sign on that variable is wrong, you are right. The sign on that variable is wrong. So controlling for funding, the proposals that the panel thought were the best actually did worse. Now, this is one table out of 9 in the paper. That result is not entirely robust, that negative result, but it is never positive. It is never positive. So there is no evidence that the proposals that the panel thought were the best proposals do better than the proposals that the panel thought were the not quite so good proposals. I do need to tell you one more thing, which is important to interpreting this, which is they have a 2-stage process in New Zealand, where in the first stage, you write a 1-page proposal, and on the basis of your 1-page proposal, they throw out 60% of them. And then the upper 40% are invited to write a more detailed proposal, which is reviewed by referees and scored and so forth. So the way to interpret this is once you throw out the dross, once you throw out the stuff that is just clearly off base, these panels are incapable of distinguishing what's left. Okay, what do I learn from that? The first thing I want to take away from this is just you can do this. It is possible. It can be done if you have the right data. Now, if you want to apply it in other settings, which I'll talk about in a second, it's harder because the outputs are harder to measure, but it can be done. There are some interesting issues of interpretation around the funding effect that I don't have time to talk about exactly how you think about that. And I should mention that these results are somewhat, the result on the inability to rank are inconsistent with some recent work from the US by Lee and Aga, where they found that for the NIH, if you look at the referee scores, they are very highly correlated, actually, with the subsequent performance of these researchers. I think it has to do partially with the fact that in New Zealand, these are very broad panels that are evaluating research across a very wide range of topics. It makes it very difficult to compare them. Okay, I'll move on from there. My second case study is talking about grants to firms. This is like an Israeli sort of program. The New Zealand government, firms come in and they say, we have an idea for a research project. We can't quite afford to do it. And the government, it used to be 50-50. They've now dropped it to 40-60. But the government pays a significant fraction of the cost based on these proposals. And we've used an innovative data set in New Zealand that links an innovation survey to the government research database. And we're looking at how the firms that got these grants, how their performance compares to the firms that didn't, using Oslo manual style questions about whether the firm had innovation. So that's essentially the setup here. And what we do is we have a control sample of matching firms, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. And as I said, we use, to measure innovation, we use Oslo manual style questions. We also have data on patents. I'm not going to talk about that because it doesn't add to the basic point. I have to put this up here because I'm using confidential microdata of Statistics New Zealand. It basically says that these results are not official statistics, and they have been reviewed to ensure that I'm not revealing any of the underlying confidential information. Okay, to do this, we don't have the kind of data we had in the case study 1, where we can have a ranking, a score to control for selection. So we use a propensity score matching technique where we use many other variables from the data to find firms that are as similar as possible on observable measures to the firms that got the grants. And we use that as the control group here. And then we do various robustness tests to explore whether we really think we've dealt with the selection bias. So just quickly, the results. The program works. And it works sort of in the way you'd like it to work, in that if you look at things like, did you have any new process or any new product? There is no statistically significant effect. But if you look at sales that are new to the world, if you had an innovation that is new to the world, if we look at the sales, the fraction of your sales that can be attributed to such products, we get an economically and statistically significant effect of receiving a grant. So the grant does seem to lead to at least more innovation, although I'll comment in a minute, when we've taken this further and tried to connect it to things like productivity, we actually can't find it there. So it is a little bit unclear how much this means. I'd like to quickly comment on these robustness checks, because I think one of the things it illustrates is what you can do when you have really good micro data. So one of the things we did to try to test whether this propensity score matching is really controlling for the unobservable difference between the funded firms and the unfunded firms is we said, let's take another intervention that shouldn't be increasing innovation and apply this same machinery to it. If the firms that are funded are just good firms in some very general way, then we're going to find that getting funding makes them better in this other way, even though that wasn't aimed at innovation. Whereas if we really have control for the things that affect innovation, we should find that when you look at a treatment that isn't intended to increase innovation, there's no effect. Sort of in the jargon of modern econometrics, this is called a placebo test. Well, we kind of passed the placebo test, but not entirely. We did two. One is we looked at, does getting an R&D grant increase employee satisfaction? You know, if the firms that get the grants are just good firms, you might think that the ones that got the grants would have higher employee satisfaction. We find that's not true. So that's good news. We passed that placebo test. Then we looked at another program, which is enterprise training. And we find that actually does have a small effect on innovation. Now, we don't actually know whether that's because there's a little bit of selection bias floating around that we didn't quite pick up, or whether maybe training your employees really does lead to more innovation. So anyway, I just think it's interesting to think about in these big data sets where you have a lot of information about these firms, how you can use them. Okay, I'm okay on time because nobody's put up any signs yet. So either Zach is asleep or I'm doing great. Just broader lessons from this. I think, propensity score matching at least has potential for an alternative way of dealing with this selection problem. And as I've mentioned, survey data gives you a lot of scope for looking at these things in interesting ways. Okay, let me talk about my last case study, which is sort of targeted or mission-oriented research. And you have all the same problems here you have in other areas, but the one I want to focus on is you have to figure out, what does success mean? And as Manuel said, in today's world, success could mean many different things. And if we want to get serious about measuring whether these programs are successful, we got to measure the things that we're trying to accomplish. We can't just count publications and patents if our goal is to make people happier. So I've been doing some work on this. This is more preliminary than the others. We haven't really gotten to the bottom line with it. But I think it's useful to think about it. And what I argue is, you have to kind of be open-minded about how you do this. You know, there are consultants out there who, you know, you hire them and they will tell you that the rate of return on your investment was 12.6%. Or no, they won't tell you that because that's too low. They'll tell you the rate of return on your investment was 25%. I don't believe that number, and I don't think it's the right form of answer. I think you really have to be willing to look at a number of different kinds of indicators. So as I say here, you're going to look at both final and intermediate outputs. You're going to have to use sort of proxies that aren't exactly necessarily what you're looking at. There's no bottom line. You're not going to be able to come to a single number. And you have to have room for including qualitative as well as quantitative assessment in what you do. So I did this for the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment in New Zealand, and we sat down and we tried to say, what are the goals that we might be trying to achieve? And I don't for a second pretend that this is the list. I don't think there is a correct list. This is one list that we came up with where, first of all, we grouped them into 5 categories of things that we're trying to do, and they include everything from, for New Zealand, you know, building our international reputation so that people in the UK, you know, think well of New Zealand. That's one of the reasons why we fund science. Obviously, we want to reduce pollution. We want to enhance public health. We want to make better public policy. We want to help the government make better. So there's a whole range of these things. And what we did is for each of these, and I'm only going to give you, get a big matrix when you do the whole thing, but for a portion of it, what we said is for each of these, can we come up with a direct measure? In some cases, there is a direct measure. If you're trying to create new products and services, the revenue from those things is a direct measure of success. In other cases, there may be no direct measure. One of your goals is to make New Zealand citizens care about science. You sort of can't measure that directly. But maybe you can find some intermediate outcome that shows that you're making progress in that direction. Have you produced new materials that the schools are using? Have you spent time in the schools? And so forth. So my argument is, you know, you have to be opportunistic and collect information that is tailored to the objective, and it's going to be different in different cases. And in different cases, it may be more or less compelling than in other cases. But I would argue it's better than just saying we can't measure that, we're not going to try. Okay. So Zach woke up, so I will finish off with some final thoughts here. Anytime you do this, the analysis is incomplete, and someone's going to say, I don't believe your Marsden Fund results because I don't believe citations measure what the Marsden Fund is really trying to do. You know, there's always going to be a way someone can say that you've left something out and you really haven't captured what we want to capture, or, you know, it's not compelling for whatever reason. I think we just have to, we can't let that stop us. I mean, we don't in general let it stop us with research. We just keep doing it. And, you know, I think we need to be sort of open-minded and doing this in many different ways. One thing that I think is quite important, which I've been pushing in New Zealand with a little bit of success, is this whole process is greatly facilitated if you start early in the process. What typically, I think Dietmar talked about the 3 or 4 year fashion. So what typically happens is we create a program, it runs for a few years, and then someone says we ought to evaluate it. So everybody runs around like chickens with their heads cut off trying to figure out how to get the data to evaluate it. What you ought to do is, when you create the program, you should be creating the evaluation in conjunction with the program itself so that you're retaining the information, like who did we not fund, that is going to make it feasible to evaluate it down the line. So it should be, and I think if we can make this routine, it also helps with the political economy of it. If you're evaluating every program, hopefully we could get to a point where if we evaluate a program and we find it isn't exactly accomplishing what we thought it was going to accomplish, that's not the end of some politician's career. You know, if we're doing it routinely, this could become something that's more part of the culture. And then more generally, I would argue it's the government's job to sort of collect the basic data about these things that we need to understand what happened and how it was set up. And then in the modern world, increasingly, like all these different output metrics that I was looking at, you know, creative people like the people in this room will come up with ways of measuring these things, and they can go out on the internet and search for, new products or search for other kinds of impacts, as long as they can tie it to something. They need the basic information about what the government is doing and how it's doing it, so that those more general data collection methods can then be brought to bear. And I think I'm, it's very easy to be pessimistic about this stuff. Politicians hate it, and it's very unsexy. But actually, I'm optimistic about it, because I think in the modern world of big data, we have tremendous opportunities to do this in ways we never had before, as long as we can kind of get the basic structure in place. So, thank you.